Before dawn on January 3, 2026, American troops seized Venezuela's president and flew him out of the country. Within days, 40 million barrels of oil headed north. Here's the question nobody asks. If America produces more oil than any other nation in history, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, why does it still need to steal it from Venezuela? The answer is not about politics. It's about geography, chemistry, and decisions made 50 years ago that nobody has been willing to undo. Welcome to the Forgotten States. In 2025, American wells pumped a record 13.6 million barrels of crude oil every single day. On those same days, the United States bought another 6.2 million barrels from abroad. The world's biggest oil producer was also one of the world's biggest oil buyers. But it gets stranger. At the very same time America was importing millions of barrels, it was exporting millions too. In 2025, roughly 4 million barrels of American crude left the country every day, while about 6 million foreign barrels arrived. The crude leaving the country and the crude coming in weren't interchangeable. They were completely different products. America produces light crude, thin, low in sulfur, easy to refine. But all along the Gulf Coast, America's biggest refineries weren't built for it. They were set up for heavy crude, thick, packed with impurities, the kind that takes enormous processing to turn into something useful. While drillers were flooding the market with light oil, the country's refining system was built to consume the opposite. The refiners got creative. They started mixing oils together. The light crude pouring out of American shale wasn't useless. Refiners wanted some of it. They blended the thin American barrels with heavy imported barrels, creating exactly the fuel their refineries were designed to run. Meanwhile, the shale fields kept overflowing with light crude. So the extra oil was shipped off to Rotterdam, South Korea, Japan, refineries built specifically for it. America's cleanest crude wasn't staying in America. It was going to everyone else. You can watch the contradiction play out at a single set of ports: Houston Ship Channel, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, Beaumont. On one tide, a tanker pulls out loaded with West Texas oil, bound for South Korea. On the same tide, another tanker slides in, carrying crude from Canada or Iraq. They pass each other in the channel, one country's oil leaving as another country's oil arrives on the same day at the same dock. American oil comes from 3 main regions. The biggest is the Permian Basin, stretching across West Texas and southeast New Mexico. It alone produces nearly half of all U.S. crude, around 6.6 million barrels a day. Far to the north in Alberta sit the oil sands, and between them runs a pipeline network that was supposed to tie everything together. But the system was never fully completed. The key missing piece, Keystone XL. The pipeline was designed to carry 830,000 barrels a day of heavy Alberta crude down through Nebraska and onto the Gulf. Its permit was revoked in January 2021, and the company killed the project later that year. The heavy oil it was meant to move still gets pumped. It just crawls south by rail and older pipelines instead. It's slower and more expensive at every stage. Far to the northwest sits Alaska. Its oil comes off the North Slope and travels 800 miles south through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. When the pipe was new, it carried the bulk of America's production. Today it operates at a fraction of its peak. The location has boxed it in. Most of that oil doesn't move east, not without racking up serious costs. So the majority goes to the West Coast, the only place it can cheaply reach. America can't even move its Alaskan barrels east. Here's where it gets worse. There's a law written in 1920 called the Jones Act. It says any cargo shipped between 2 American ports has to be carried on a ship that is built in America, owned by Americans, flagged in America, and crewed by Americans. It was passed after World War I to protect American shipyards. 100 years later, that fleet looks very different. There are only a small number of tankers that still qualify for domestic shipping. When supply is that limited, everything changes. A Jones Act tanker can cost 3 to 4 times more to operate than a foreign flagship. Building one costs around $200 million, compared to roughly a quarter of that in an Asian shipyard. And because there are so few of them, the cost of moving oil inside the country has climbed to several times the global rate. California, Oregon, and Washington are effectively cut off from the Gulf Coast. To move oil east to west means either crossing the Rocky Mountains or sending it all the way down and around the Panama Canal. The Jones Act makes it even harder because even oil moving along the coast has to use a small, expensive domestic fleet. So the West Coast relies heavily on imports by sea, including heavy crude from the Persian Gulf. California compounds the problem. The state requires a special, cleaner blend of gasoline that very few refineries outside its borders make. So when a single California refinery goes down, the state feels it almost immediately. In 2025, a fire tore through Chevron's El Segundo refinery near Los Angeles. The plant produces roughly a sixth of California's fuel, and prices soared within days. Because of the Jones Act, fuel can't come from Texas. The special California blend isn't easily available from foreign markets, so California ends up cut off from both directions. That's a big part of why California has some of the highest gas prices in the country. But it gets worse. To move fuel from the Gulf Coast to California, shippers have sometimes routed it through the Bahamas first, not because it's faster, but because of how the rules work. American blend stock is loaded onto a foreign flag ship, sent out of the country, then blended offshore and shipped back toward the West Coast. It's a workaround to beat the Jones Act. The shortest domestic route is no longer the cheapest. The cheapest route leaves the country first, and that makes the U.S. vulnerable. When the Strait of Hormuz closed in early 2026 and fuel prices began to climb, one of the first levers the White House reached for was a Jones Act waiver. In March 2026, it switched the century-old law off for 30 days, so cheaper foreign tankers could move fuel between American ports during the crisis. A country that has to suspend its own shipping law to move fuel along its own coastline is telling you something pretty simple. It doesn't have enough ships. It's not just civilian fuel that depends on those ships either. The Navy's own fueling network for the East Coast and Gulf bases relies on the same pool of tankers as everyone else. When a hurricane or a refinery outage pulls one of those ships out of rotation, the same panic that spikes prices at a Houston gas station also complicates how fast the military can move fuel between its own ports. America is trapped. It's a country that can't deliver its own oil to its people, not without using someone else's ships, someone else's refineries, or someone else's crude. But before you call it broken, there is another possibility. It may be working exactly as intended, just not for the person buying at the gas pump. When ExxonMobil pulls a barrel from the Permian, it sells it into the world market at the global price. After taking over Pioneer Natural Resources, Exxon now controls a huge slice of that basin. Shipping the oil overseas ensures the best price available. It also keeps the home market from drowning in light crude nobody can use. Too much of it at home drives prices down at the well. So, exporting is the smartest move available, and it's exactly what gets rewarded. The largest oil refinery in the U.S. is the Motiva plant in Port Arthur, Texas. I know that the tech meat comes in the base. It processes about 650,000 barrels a day, and it's owned outright by Saudi Aramco. The single biggest piece of American refining flies a Saudi flag. Along the coast are more giants. Valero, Marathon's Galveston Bay complex, Chevron's refinery at Pascagoula in Mississippi, built around Venezuelan grades. Each of these companies spent decades perfecting one thing: turning cheap, nasty, heavy crude into diesel, jet fuel, and chemicals. The gap between what refiners pay for a barrel of heavy crude and what they sell the finished products for is where the money is made. From 1975 until December 2015, crude oil exports were essentially banned outright. The law came out of the 1970s oil shocks, written specifically to stop American crude from leaving the country while Americans queued at the pump. For 4 decades, it held. Then the shale boom broke it. By the early 2010s, drillers were producing more light crude than the domestic refining system could use. The ale had nowhere to go. Storage tanks were filling up. Prices at the wellhead started collapsing, even while the rest of the world was paying far more for the same barrel. Producers were sitting on oil they couldn't sell at a price that made drilling worth it. So in December 2015, Congress lifted the ban. It worked exactly as intended. American shale found a global market. Prices stabilized. Producers kept drilling. Shale boom that turned America into the world's largest oil producer needed that export valve to survive. Because the Gulf Coast refining system isn't just where gasoline comes from. It's where diesel comes from, the fuel that powers jets and the Navy. The U.S. Armed Forces are the largest single institutional fuel consumer on the planet. A meaningful share of what keeps them running is refined from the exact heavy crude blends this entire story has been about. So when Washington loses a heavy crude supplier, it isn't just losing a vendor, it's losing security. That is worth a coup. It's worth an invasion. That's worth flying a head of state to New York in handcuffs. We saw it again when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in early 2026. The busiest oil export route on Earth ground to a halt almost overnight. Gasoline that had been sitting near $3 a gallon jumped by roughly 30%. Within weeks, it was pushing toward $4. Brent crude surged past $110 a barrel. American crude climbed past $100. And none of it mattered that the United States was still producing oil at near record levels. But production doesn't set the price. The global margin does. And when that margin breaks, the shock does not stay at the pump. It spreads. Diesel moves first, then trucking costs, then food, then everything that moves by truck. A higher diesel price shows up in cereal, in fertilizer, in lumber. Jet fuel moves next, and suddenly flights cost more too. No one connects it to a strait they've never heard of. The headlines are, missiles in the Persian Gulf. The cost shows up everywhere else, though, and this time, the country emptied its piggy bank. In mid-March 2026, Washington released about 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was the largest single-country emergency oil release in history. It led to a joint release of roughly 400 million barrels by 32 allied nations. All of it was triggered by the closure of one strait on the far side of the world. And one detail should worry Americans the most. While the United States was emptying its reserve, its biggest rival was busy filling one. China has spent the last few years buying up crude to stash away. That buying alone helped keep global prices up. When the next shock arrives, China will be sitting on a bigger reserve. The country that pumps the most oil on Earth will be sitting on a thinner one. And that is not a sign of strength.